Welcome back, everyone. I will talk about the Korean experience over the past 50 years. Korea's first privatization drive started in 1960, conducted by then President Park Chung-hee. He conducted very successful privatization, including Korean Air. Second phase was during 1980s, and this was not very successful reform or privatization because government tried to maintain their ownership of commercial banks even after the privatization. And so it was not a privatization in the real sense of the word. The third phase was not successful either because of lack of political motivation. I will talk about this later. The fourth phase was under President Kim Dae-jung, was most active period for privatization drive because it was right after the economic crisis. I was lucky enough to join the government as a contract-based civil servant in the Ministry of Planning and Budget and involved in this reform and privatization process as a civil servant. And the fifth phase under President Lee Myung-bak mostly focused on privatization of subsidiaries. His reform efforts was not very successful because he did not get a public support. I will talk about those backgrounds to you. The first Korean experience was under the President Park. He privatized many SOE, and one interesting point is that in that era, investment in kind, such as providing land, was considered as investment, and that was one of the way of privatization. In other words, you provide the big land for a certain SOE, and you get an ownership of the SOE. So that kind of privatization was very different from those of these years, recent years. So he privatized many SOE, but of course he was not free from some transparency issue. But at the same time, he also created some new SOEs as well. And during 1970s, President Park Chung-hee conducted this strong drive for heavy and chemical industries in steel, shipbuilding, chemical, automobile, electronics. These 5 industries has been a backbone of Korean economy until even as of now. Okay. However, he did not create monopolistic SOE much. Only in the case of network industry, he created monopolistic SOE. So steel, shipbuilding, chemical industry, although he established SOE, there was a competition between SOE and private sector. And these SOEs were all privatized later. And automobile and electronics, there was no SOE. It was only private company. So President Park Chung-hee tried to utilize the market force as much as possible. Although at initial point, he needed some SOE as a path breaker of a new investment. He invite competition quickly and privatized SOE as soon as possible. Second stage was under President Chun Doo-hwan and President Roh Tae-woo. During this era, the 4 commercial banks were tried to be privatized, but it was not successful because government sold only the partial share of the government's ownership. They did not transfer the majority ownership. And there is a strong government's the policy against the owning of the financial company by the big chaebol, big conglomerates. They did not allow big conglomerates to own financial institutions. And instead, they try to sell the minority share to the public. What do you think of these two policies? Well, big conglomerates should not own banks. Do you agree with this or not? Well, maybe it is they should not own the bank in the initial stage of development. Because if big conglomerates have banks of their own, they can finance their own insolvent projects. Okay, so there is no equal playground between company with a bank, company without bank. There is no fair competition. But this is true only when there is a shortage of capital. But now, in many countries, the capital itself is not scarce resources. And now in Korea, the capital is abundant. In that case, a big company should be allowed to own a bank. Okay? Because the bank can be more efficient when it is managed by big companies. And sales of minority share is useful for the performance. Well, Korean experience says that it is not the case. Selling minority share is not a useful way of privatization. It is not a privatization, in fact. So, well, it is better than no sales of government share at all, but it only used as an excuse of delaying privatization process. So, transferring majority share, okay, that is really important, and that should be implemented as soon as possible. The third phase is during the 1990s by President Kim Il-sung. He was not really enthusiastic about privatization because privatization has many political messages. First, people worry about economic concentration. Okay? So what if big chaebol, big conglomerates buy SOE and become even bigger? So we had a strong principle that big 30 conglomerates should not join this privatization process. And people also worry about the negative impact on the stock market. Because when you sell your government share, the stock price, general index, will have to go down. So people do not like this sales of big state-owned enterprise. And also, of course, as privatization is hated by labor union and line ministries. So the president has no strong political motivation to pursue this privatization. Maybe in the past, when Korea was under a dictator, maybe those dictators could enjoy some economic gain from this privatization process. But President Kim Il-sung was the first non-military president, and he wanted to stay clean. So he did not want to be involved in this transparency issue. So he did not really into this privatization process. And when the president has no appetite for privatization, it is very natural for the privatization to not progress much. So we have a lesson that political motivation is very important for privatization. And the fourth phase was done around 2000, right after the economic crisis. As I mentioned, it was the most successful privatization drive in Korea's history. It was right after the economic crisis. So recovery from the crisis is number one national agenda. And international credit rating is very important to recover from the economic crisis. How can improve our international credit rating? Privatization was a signal for the foreign investor. So that's why President Kim Dae-jung and all the Korean public strongly supported this privatization. By the survey of KDI, 80% of Korean people supported this privatization. That was a survey done 1999. So it was a very successful privatization drive. And another success factor was the driving force of privatization. President Kim Dae-jung established Government Reform Office under Ministry of Planning and Budget, who actively worked as a driver of privatization. I was lucky enough to be the part of this the organization. However, many of his privatization plan was stopped by his successor, President Roh Moo-hyun, and that gives us another lesson that privatization should be completed within the current presidency. Well, this was the result of the privatization after the economic crisis. Okay? Immediate privatization and phased privatization, single ownership, multiple ownership. With this two-dimensional category, many companies, many SOEs were privatized immediately by single ownership method. And POSCO, a steel company, was immediately privatized, but by the multiple ownership method. These state-owned enterprises were under phased privatization plan by multiple ownership. So this is mostly network industry, except this tobacco and ginseng. And among these privatization plans, only 3 were successful. Other state-owned enterprises were not privatized because the next president stopped this plan. Okay, and so with this category, 2 kinds of category: maximum share for one domestic owner. In other words, no single owner, no restriction, and maximum share for foreigners, and no restriction. So with this two-dimensional category, KT, Korea Telecom, was privatized by 2 types of regulation: no single domestic owner, and on maximum share for foreigners. Okay, you can levy these type of restrictions, so that you can avoid any worry about foreign capital dominance or single owner dominance. Okay. And these are the outcome of the President Kim Dae-jung's privatization drive. And out of 11 plans, 8 has been achieved. Why 3 are missing? Because this phased privatization had 6 in plan, but only 3 successful. Okay. However, many subsidiaries were privatized, so the number of public enterprise has been reduced dramatically within this 4-year time interval. And as a result of this privatization, their net benefit increased a lot. And the only exception was POSCO. That was because of the external factor, of Chinese factor and international the price. But their market value has gone up rapidly without any exception. So privatization enhances the stock price of SOE dramatically. Okay. Well, this is the final stage, the privatization during 2008 through 13 by President Lee Myung-bak. His plan was not successful. Well, he privatized some of the subsidiaries, but he tried to privatize bank, but failed. He tried to sell minority share of Incheon Airport, but he failed. The background of this failure is his loss of public trust after the candlelight protest in 2009 over U.S. beef import. After these incidents, he lost public support and he was not able to pursue his privatization plan. Okay? And people turned very negative against privatization at the time of 2009. If you compare 1999 and 2009, within this only 11-year of time period, you will see a very different attitude of the public towards privatization. In 1999, right after the economic crisis, there has been a landslide approval for privatization. 80% say yes to the privatization. Even though there could be unemployment, privatization should be pursued. That has been a public opinion. But the approval rate went down to 20%. Why people's support is so dramatically different? Well, in 1997, it was right after the economic crisis, and this crisis was viewed as a result of the government failure. However, 2009 was right after the global financial crisis of 2008, and people thought that this global financial crisis was caused by market failure, not government failure. So people's attitude towards the private sector and privatization has dramatically changed. So this gives us a very important lesson. Even though you have a public support now, it can be changed dramatically soon. Okay? You should be aware of the changing people's attitude towards privatization. If you lose public support, privatization cannot be pursued. Well, this is one example of privatization, example of Korea Telecom. Well, if you go through this whole process, it shows everything about privatization. It started as a government body, and it has been corporatized. It transformed into a state-owned enterprise in 1981. Okay, before then, it was a government body. Okay? And about 10 years later, we introduced competition. International call, and then long-distance call, followed by local call. So competition has been introduced. And then, and at the same time, they try to sell minority share, okay, slowly. And they sold some of the subsidiary. One of them was mobile business. So they sold their mobile business division. That was one of their subsidiary. But in fact, that turned out to be the most biggest telecom business in Korea. It is the start of SKT now. It's number one in mobile phone business in Korea. Okay? That was only a subsidiary of KT, but now it is the biggest player in the telecom market. And then this privatization process was very slow because there was a strong resistance and people worried about negative impact on the stock market. So they had to wait until the economic crisis when the privatization plan was made. So in 1998, they list their stock in the stock market. Okay, so they start selling their minority share, but they still maintained their government's majority share until 2001. Okay, during 2001, this sales process was relatively slow. So they thought, maybe we should invite more foreign investor. So they enhanced the maximum foreign share limit from 32 to 49. Okay, and that's the time foreign capital respond to this. So foreign capital comes in, and government share drops to 28% now. Okay, but still, government was number one shareholder. Although less than 50%, government was the biggest shareholder. And finally, 2002, they sold this remaining 28% outside of the stock market. Okay, take a look at this. They did not sell in the stock market, which can have a big influence on the stock price. They sold the remaining share outside of the stock market. Okay. Now let's take a look at the things to do with or after the privatization. After the privatization is over, you will have to take these into consideration as a policymaker. First, you will have to bring or maintain competition in the market. Okay? And when you invite new entry, you will always have to consider competitive neutrality. Okay? After you privatize your SOE, this SOE, which is newly privatized, should be compete with other private company equally in a fair manner. Try not to give an advantage over this newly privatized company. And the price should be maintained and should be regulated by new regulatory body. So you may have to establish a new regulatory body to govern the price scheme of this new privatized SOE, and especially when it is SOE in a network industry, the need for regulatory body is more important. Okay, and you will have to make a new price scheme because in old SOE, the cross-subsidization is very common. Okay, so one sector rate is higher and subsidizing the other sector so that the price can be lower. So this cross-subsidization should be cleared, and new price scheme will have to be introduced in a gradual manner because you need time to adjust this new price scheme from the consumer's point of view. Of course, the policy function should be shifted to ministry. If it was within the SOE, now the policy function should be shifted to ministry when this policy is still necessary. Okay. Finally, the management of newly privatized SOE has to be transparent. So the board of directors is very important, especially the first one. The first board of directors of newly privatized company is very, very important. Okay. And KT&G is the tobacco and ginseng. It used to be a SOE and privatized in 2002 in Korea. They don't have a single ownership. They have a multiple ownership without one dominant shareholder, but they have a very well-structured board of directors. Okay, separation of chairman of the board and CEO, and more than 50% of outside board members. So these are important factors of good board of directors. And by this Korea Corporation Governance Service, supported by the government, this KT&G was selected many times as the best company in the corporate governance. Okay? So it used to be a state-owned enterprise, but now it is privatized. But their governance structure is very, very effective and transparent. And that's why KT&G, although it is a tobacco industry, they shows rising revenue. It's very difficult for a cigarette company to enjoy higher revenue. It all thanks to the good composition of board of governors. What is the success factor behind this good governance? That was the first board of directors after the privatization. Why the first board of director composition was good? Because there was observation from foreign capital. This board of directors were recruited right after the economic crisis. So the whole world was watching this KT&G and their governance. So Korean government tried to show the perfect example to the outside world. Okay? So that's why the first board of directors were very well selected, and that's why still they are example of corporate governance. And currently, national pension system is taking up around 11% of share, but they are very neutral shareholder, and that's another important success factor. Okay? Well, the government may want to maintain their influence on the SOE even after they are privatized. Okay? There are different ways of that intervention. You may have a golden share. It is of veto power to change the major decision, like a company charter. It was utilized in Britain, but EU illegalized the golden share. So I don't think you can utilize easily. And the government can maintain the minor share, and through this minor share you can influence the SOEs. But if you intervene too much, there will be a strong criticism on this lingering influence of the government. Of course, you can have a contract with the privatized SOE over a certain public service. Okay? From the government's point of view, when they need a certain service provided by this SOE to the public, they can make a contract with this SOE. Okay? Of course, they have to pay. Finally, of course, most legitimate method of intervention is regulatory body, okay? Especially in the case of network industry. So the bottom line is that the government should not intervene too much. After it is privatized, it is a private sector. So government should not intervene too much. Only through regulatory body or the contract. Okay? That's how the government should intervene in the privatized SOE. Well, after privatization drive is over, Korea still has 36 SOEs left. But privatization should not be stopped. It is a continuous process, and there are some SOEs that can be privatized. Okay? So this current Korean government is not putting much emphasis on this reform efforts, but maybe sometime in the future, we may have to privatize some of these SOEs that we are still maintaining. And privatization is only one way of reform of SOE. There are other means, like transfer to local government in case of Korea Airport Corporation, or you can bring competition in case of gas corporation, or you can integrate different company, like gas company and oil company. Maybe they can be integrated in Korea. Or they can change their business from an active investor in the resource development to secondary participant after the private sector. Okay? And so sometimes we may have to liquidate state-owned enterprise, including Korea Coal Corporation. Okay? Sometimes a certain SOE may have to be shifted from under the Ministry to under the Ministry of Land to Ministry of Environment. So these reforms should be continued. Okay? Of course, good governance of remaining SOE is, of course, always very important. Okay, finally, these are the lessons from Korean experience. Okay, political will is very important, and public support is very important. And network industry is very tricky. Okay, so competition and regulation policy should be coupled with this privatization process. And without a single ownership, the government influence on privatized SOE may remain. So it is better to invite a single ownership. And when you don't have such single ownership, it's very important to have first board of director right. Okay? You will have to make it transparent so that it can be composed of really good people. So first board of director is very important for newly privatized state-owned enterprise. And having a right driver of privatization is important. And you can privatize subsidiaries first. That's easier, and you can set an example for the major privatization drive. Finally, reform for state-owned enterprise should not be stopped. It's a continuous effort. So privatization and better governance and all other types of reform should be continued to increase the quality of the service and reduce the cost involved for the people. Okay, that's it for today. And if there's any question, I'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you very much.